Good morning, everyone. My name is Alan Kwok, and I'm the Director of Climate and Disaster Resilience at Northern California Grantmakers. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm calling in from the Ohlone land here in the Bay Area in our office in San Francisco. On behalf of Philanthropy California, I welcome you to Investment Strategies to Address Climate Change in California. This session is the third in the four-part Philanthropy California learning series for institutional as well as individual impact investors across the state. They are sponsored by and in partnership with RBC Global Asset Management. Here at Philanthropy California, which includes Northern California Grantmakers, SoCal Grantmakers, and Catalysts of San Diego and Imperial counties, we and our over 700 plus philanthropic members seek to address our impact in building and sustaining thriving and equitable communities. Yet our vision of ours is currently being threatened by the increasing risk and impacts of climate-driven events. You yourself have probably experienced the effects of climate change in a form of increasing frequency of very hot days, water use restrictions, cancel vacation plans, because of wildfire smoke. Yet for our very vulnerable communities, especially our BIPOC communities, they bear the brunt of climate change on a day-to-day basis, from including lost wages, displacement due to wildfires, prolonged exposure to toxic smoke, water and food insecurities, and much more. As a sector, we need to use all of our available tools to collectively address climate change, the risk and the impacts on people, communities, and our natural environment. As many of our funders and investors continue to support equitable COVID-19 recovery, we must also think about how can we climate-proof these investments in the future, as we know that climate change impacts will continue to affect more and more people in the years to come. So today, we are very excited and honored to have experts and practitioners in the field to share with us the what, how, and why of integrating climate lens to impact investments, opportunities and equitable considerations as more investors engage in this space, as well as other investment vehicles that are already on the market that advance climate resilience in California. Before I turn this conversation to our moderator and speakers, I just want to share a few housekeeping details. First, this session is being recorded and you'll receive a link to the recording afterwards. We will also have time for dialogue between you and our speakers towards the end of the session. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat box to share them. At the end of the session, we'll share with you a 3-question poll. Please take the time to take out the poll, to fill out the poll, because we can use the feedback to help improve future programs. And lastly, we want you to stay connected with us at Philanthropy California, and we'll be sharing the ways in which you can connect with us. So now I'll turn our conversation to our moderator for this discussion, Stacy Swan, CEO of Climate Finance Advisors. Stacy.
Hi, Alan. Do you mind? I had a whole really excellent introduction for Stacy planned here, and I would hate for the participants to miss that.
Wonderful. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So I will be brief. My name is Brian Fairhurst. I'm with RBC Global Asset Management. And as Alan mentioned, this is our third out of 4 series of hopefully dynamic discussions around social and climate related impact topics this year. And it's part of our ongoing collaboration with the grant making societies in California for aggregating impact across your members to really try to bring scale in the liquid markets, addressing what are clearly inextricably linked social and climate related impact elements. So we're thrilled to be a part of this again. And I'm really excited that Brian Svindal is joining the conversation. He is our head of impact strategies for all of RBC GAM in the US, and hyper focused on that link between social impact, social justice, and climate. And the two could not be more connected. As I was riding to school this morning with my son on our bicycles for the statewide annual walk or ride to school day addressing climate-related impact of busy parents dropping kids off at school, and the health-related elements of that, I just felt how fortunate we are that we are in a safe place where we can ride our bikes to school, and many underserved communities don't have that luxury. So the climate and social elements are just so hyper connected, and this is something that Brian and his team spent all day long focusing on for our institutional clients. So without further ado, Stacy Swan's resume is deep and wide and very impressive, but what I thought would be interesting to highlight is if you look her up on LinkedIn, behind her headshot, you will see a picture of Cerro Chaltén, or Mount Fitzroy, which sits at the edge of the southern Patagonia ice cap, and I think is the perfect canary in the coal mine for the global climate crisis we have. It's actually one of the only ice caps that's actually increasing in size, but that's not a positive indicator. It just shows how messed up the climatic systems outside the poles are, and including the poles. It's the second largest ice cap outside of the poles. It is growing, it is healthy, it's pristine, and it's one of the only healthy and pristine ice caps left on the planet, which is really our air conditioning system. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Stacy to moderate this panel, and thank you all for participating today.
Thanks, Brian. And before I get started, have you been to Fitzroy?
I have. I've been to the base. I didn't get to climb it. We got weathered out, but Patagonia is my favorite place on planet Earth. It's absolutely stunning.
It's absolutely beautiful. And that picture I took, we went, it was the last trip, international trip, family trip that I took before COVID. My family and I were there over Christmas and New Year's of 2019, 2020, and the weather cooperated. The week before we were there, it was covered in clouds. We got there, it was nice for 3 days. We went up. So that was a picture kind of on the way up, and it is absolutely stunning. And I would encourage anybody to put it on your bucket list and towards the top of your bucket list for sure. It's beautiful there. So thank you, Brian, for that introduction. And I'm here to be your moderator and ask some interesting questions of our panelists. And maybe before I do, I'll just set up a little bit of context. It's not often that people can find the connections between the financial community and equity and justice. And I think that that's why some of these conversations are starting, because as Brian mentioned, these things are absolutely inextricably linked and really important in terms of figuring out ways that the financial community, investors, can help to accelerate the sustainability that we all need, not just for returns, but for all of our communities and our states and our countries and the globe. Climate change is a fact. It's accelerating. It's accelerating faster than we're making the right investments. And if you read the IPCC report that came out in August, you'll know that maybe it's actually faster than we really thought, even kind of in the policy space in the international world. We really thought we kind of had enough time to kind of create the right policies and the right incentives. So it's a sobering kind of message that the science community sent us, but I will say I'm pretty hopeful because the financial community is definitely starting to wake up, and they're waking up in many ways and for many reasons. Some of the work that we've done in the last couple of years has started to show the connections between climate-related financial risks and the cost of capital. If you look and do some regressive scenarios on sovereign bonds, for example, for some emerging markets, there's research out there that's starting to show some connectivity between highly vulnerable countries to climate change and their sovereign bond ratings. And when you talk to the rating agencies, you get the sense that that's partly being driven by this perception of climate risk. All the rating agencies have also built the capacity internally, either by acquiring companies or hiring smart people or both, to start quantifying climate-related financial risks. And that is going to have an amazing shift in their ability to start to figure out kind of what climate risk means from a financial perspective. There's a lot of momentum in the financial community in certain sectors, in banking and in pension funds and institutional investors around really putting together portfolios and investment pipelines that are more sustainable, that have reduced climate risks, that have built-in resilience, whether it's to physical impacts of climate change or transition risks that might come about because of our transition to the net zero economy. So that's pretty important to keep an eye on as well. People are paying attention. Investor awareness is really high. Investor understanding may still be quite low, may still be something that people are trying to get their hands around, but awareness is accelerating too, and that's something that I'm pretty hopeful for. And then third, I would say on the policy side, some policy signals have been meaningful in the last 4 or 5 years, but just about 10 days ago, the SEC issued a sample letter essentially signaling some of the questions they're going to start asking for their regulated entities around how they're identifying, assessing, monitoring climate-related risks, how they're managing climate-related risks. This could have kind of its own effect in terms of getting people to really start rolling up their sleeves on this. That also gives me hope. I will say that sample letter is not a rule. At the very bottom on the footnote, it says it's just guidance, but it's definitely causing some waves among people who are regulated by the SEC. And the letter starts, and this is pretty important, the letter starts with a little paragraph that says, hey, you company, we notice you're talking about climate change a lot in your corporate social responsibility reports, but not in your SEC filings. Tell us why. So, you know, the SEC is starting to think about this in serious ways. Who knows if this will become a rule, but it's certainly a signal to the market. The Wall Street Journal reported 2 days later that the letter was actually delivered to 22 companies. We don't know who. We don't know. The journal article listed a few sectors, but we don't know who got the letter. But you know, I think if you get a letter from the SEC, you start to kind of think about this in a little bit of a different way. All of those things in my mind give me some hope that the financial community is that awareness is going to start to be matched by understanding. And once awareness and understanding are matched, then, you know, they're going to start to think about the right investment opportunities that can help us address climate change. And equity and justice is really woven into all of this because the people and communities who are most at risk are the ones that really need to be kind of focused on by this community. So anyway, enough from me. I'm going to start by asking a few questions of our panelists. And maybe when I ask you a question, take a couple of minutes to just talk about who you are, your background, where you come from. And then I will go around. And I think I'll start with Brian first. So Brian Svendal, nice to see you. If you could give me a little bit of insights, given your macro level perspectives, give us some insights on impact investing. What are the trends you're seeing and strategies to mitigate climate change and building climate resiliency?
Great, thanks. Nice to meet you, Stacy. And Brian introduced me. Remember, I'm in the liquid fixed income markets. I manage bond funds, impact bond funds in particular. And I'm happy to hear that you are optimistic because you spend 100% of your time in this space. And I'm really rather worried. So looking at those, when you talk about solutions and trends, or trends in solutions and resiliency, I feel like the market is far too slow and still too reactive in resiliency measures. So I'm worried more that we're on the 3 to 4 degree path. And so there will be a lot of trouble that comes along with that. So the investment landscape is still totally dominated by all of what I would think of as offenders: oil, gas, pipelines, autos, transport, even coal in banks, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So it's far outstrips what's available in something like wind or solar, et cetera. And I thought you made an excellent point in terms of the acceleration of climate change and not the acceleration of how we're investing in that renewable infrastructure. So it's not, I think we have the same mix in renewables for energy consumption that we have for the last 25 years. It's like 14, 15%. So it's still a really small number. I think resiliency as a topic and the reactiveness of it, New Orleans is a great example where we spent $19 billion or something like that to try and build a wall around the city, and it still can't handle a hurricane. So it gets like totally knocked over. And I think Sunita will talk about this a little more in terms of the low income communities getting impacted by far the most, and the way we invest in them now with still not a great eye towards climate. So low income communities being housed in the very weakest areas from a resiliency perspective. So there's spots of optimism, but we need to hurry up.
Great. And any trends on the impact investing side of beyond the renewables? Anything you're seeing there?
In renewables, there are spots. I would say the muni market, asset-backed market has some opportunities. And then there's CDFIs and nonprofits that are starting to issue bonds, and so they're tapping the market, creating a little bit of leverage, which is really what they need.
Yeah.
And I would say some of the international programs, so OPIC or DFC in particular, that has some good projects more globally. And I would say into, as usual, Europe is a little farther ahead. So if you go into the non-dollar space, there's more opportunities that way as well.
And for what I'm hearing you say, there's a pipeline problem of sustainable investments, essentially.
Well, I think for me, it's more of how to bring scale. And so the best example of scale in the fixed income market in the US is the mortgage market, where mortgages in the US function really, really well. It's like $3, $4, $5 trillion. It's everything is, and what you need for that scale to happen is uniformity of projects, uniformity of loans, and some form of government risk sharing or intervention. So I think like the ABS example is maybe the closest to where scale is coming. California requiring more solar to get done in a residential way, and then those loans become standardized, and now there are billion-dollar deals off of solar in particular.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, coupling kind of good policy guidance, standards, directives kind of is going to help accelerate the actual investments in the pipeline. And if I'm hearing you correctly say, you're looking for pipeline, and there's still far too much kind of from a balance perspective in the fossil sector and in the kind of old kind of energy economy sector. Yeah. It's a true and valid point. I think that's for sure definitely happening. I think I'm going to turn to Nick now, because maybe Nick, you can give us some insights from the Forest Resilience Bond, because one of the things that this does is it deploys private capital to finance forest restorations on private and public lands. Can you maybe talk a little bit about it, how it might be applicable in California? And then maybe also to address Brian's kind of comments, scale. How can we scale something like this?
Absolutely. Thank you, Stacy, and thank you for those comments, Brian, as well. The mortgage markets and infrastructure financing products and fixed income that you're speaking about are the inspiration for how we're trying to scale the Forest Resilience Bond. My name is Nick Wobrock. I'm with Blue Forest Conservation, co-founded 6 years ago. And we're a nonprofit that develops fixed income investment projects in forest restoration, looking at our watersheds and our forests as natural infrastructure to be able to accommodate some of the threats and risks that climate change is posing, so that we can actually invest in climate adaptation and climate resilience, in part to help protect the natural resources that, if those fires were to occur, would threaten. I have a couple slides actually, Carlos, that might be able to share just so people can see the structure of what we're talking about. If you'd be able to get to slide 2, be able to share. And while thank you for pulling that up. So So the Forest Resilience Bond, we'll actually share in a couple slides what the structure of our first project, and we're about to launch the second project as well. But fixed income investors put money into an SPV that then funds, we call the Forest Resilience Bond, project by project, that funds implementation partners who do work on the ground. That type of work is forest thinning and prescribed fire, actually trying to mimic quite a few of the tribal land management practices that we continue to learn more and more about in terms of how fire was put on the land intentionally, and that some of that underbrush and clearing could occur in healthy and ecological ways so that that can help reduce some of the risk of really big and damaging catastrophic fires. Those restoration activities help protect and enhance, in some ways, ecosystem services that benefit beneficiaries such as water and electric utilities, could be insurance companies that have fire risk exposure, and can be jobs and community benefits as well in rural environments. Those beneficiaries pay back the SPV over time, and then that pays back investors. If you go to the next slide, Carlos, what Blue Forest specifically does to try and connect that investor capital to good projects on the left, which really are enhancing and protecting those critical ecosystem services, is we help with many partners like the World Resources Institute and local and environmental nonprofits. We help and some academic institutions as well. We evaluate the benefits of doing those projects, how that might enhance the ecosystem services, and then develop contracts and agreements and a financial vehicle that in the end, we're trying to make it look as boring as possible so that it can mimic mortgage structures and natural infrastructure investing, but in the form of natural infrastructure. All of this is to make it so it can be as simple as a mortgage that's repaid by multiple sources over time, trying to blend money from local governments, state governments, federal governments, and water and electric utilities as well. And I'll just share one more slide to show the structure of our first project, because I think folks might be interested in that. And then I'd love to share a little bit about why this work is so important as well. So our first project was $4 million in size. It had a blend of capital from different investors, some market rate investors like Calvert Impact Capital and AAA's investment arm, CSAA Investment, and then a handful of PRI investors too. And blending that concessionary capital could cover the principal of the project cost that's repaid principal and interest by a host of local contracts from a water agency as well as governmental entities. And so this was, these slides can be shared, I think, from Carlos later as well, but just wanted to share a little bit of the structure. Now, why is this so important too? A $4 million project, it's pretty small. It's protecting 15,000 acres. The Forest Service in California alone has said 6 to 8 million acres are in need of restoration. And just recently, we saw the Dixie Fire, we saw the Caldor Fire. Some are the biggest in history. The Caldor Fire also is the first fire to ever cross the slope of the Sierra Nevada, so going across the top slope. And we are hearing from the Forest Service that type of fire behavior had never been observed before. But who also bears much of the cost from these projects? So while South Lake Tahoe was threatened for the first time, the town of Paradise was totally decimated, and the type of economic realities in those communities, it's lower income and lower access, to be frank, as well as when there's air quality impacts from this work. Those who are from fires, those who are able to avoid negative air quality are those who can live in better, well-sealed houses, those who can afford air conditioning and air purifiers. And so there really is an equity standpoint, even in public health, with respect to what these fires are, who they're impacting and who they're impacting most. So thank you. You can stop sharing, Carlos, for sake of conversation.
And Nick, what's any thoughts about the scalability of something like this, and in particular to help build a pipeline for investors?
Yeah, absolutely. And well, actually, Carlos, we can share where we're working as well across the Western US. In that last slide 6, actually 5 and 6, the Forest Service has said, so it's 6 to 8 million acres in California alone. Across the US, it's 40 to 55 million acres. And the average cost is often pegged at about $1,000 per acre for this type of restoration work. Now it can vary from $500 to $2,500 per acre, but we're looking at a tens of billions of dollar need to address this challenge. And the reality is that the cost of doing this work is less than the benefits and the cost, if we do nothing, that we're going to experience over time. So we're really motivated about the Yuba project too. That $4 million project I showed, that's depicted in the about 15,000 acres in this graphic of what we're looking at as the Yuba watershed. And there's a partnership that came together that includes the Yuba Water Agency, the National Forest Foundation, a local environmental group, a tribal entity, the Nature Conservancy, Blue Forest as well. And in that partnership, there's been a commitment to evaluate how can we scale that little investment in the upper right to help protect and enhance the whole watershed to avoid catastrophic fire. And there's been mega fires just north and south of this watershed. If those were to occur, the hydropower, the recreational value, the community values, flooding risks, all the carbon emissions associated with such a fire too, would really be so incredibly costly that the economic modeling that Blue Forest with our partners and academic groups and the World Resource Institute have done have shown that over time, even with some high or some probability of fire, these investments can make economic sense and pencil out. With those payments from the protected ecosystem services and the avoided costs if those fires were to occur. Now, monetizing avoided costs in part is, again, an infrastructure investment. It's making that case to the local authorities on what the cost might be if those fires were to occur and to model that out, as well as what might be some of the local benefits in terms of jobs, and water quality and water quantity that could occur if the projects were to be implemented. So we're scaling from this pilot project to elsewhere in the Yuba, but on the next slide as well, Carlos, is to show some of the projects. And again, these are all partnerships. This is with many different academic and other environmental groups and nonprofits, and quite a collaboration, as well as with the Forest Service. And I know it's sort of a grainy graphic, but across the West, from Oregon, Washington, and California, Montana, they've all shown quite a few interests from forests. And in fact, in that question of how do we scale, part of it is showing a good track record. And this one Yuba pilot project helped bring the North Yuba Forest Partnership to reality, where folks said, let's jump on board because this seems like it has legs and there's interest. But not just within that Yuba watershed. In Southern Oregon, the Medford Water Commission reached out to us. In Central Washington State, Chelan County reached out to us. And then that's in addition to the Klamath National Forest in Northern California and quite a few other entities that have said, we've seen that Yuba project, that was really motivating. Can we try and do that here? And this is such a collaboration and partnership, and it really depends on the learnings that can be brought from so many interdisciplinary types of teams. But we are really motivated by how this story can scale and the need and the clear economics for why action is important. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Nick. We may come back to you in a minute, but I'll now turn to Sanetta. Hi, Sanetta. It's nice to see you. Let's talk about the history of inequitable development and how that can play into our efforts to scale up sustainable investment. Our national history of inequitable development and divestment means that people at the greatest risk from climate change often live in the most vulnerable places and in low-income communities and communities of color. How does this legacy of not prioritizing climate change and climate resiliency build towards a new version of redlining?
Thank you, Stacy. So my name is Sanita Devono Powell, and I'm a little bit of a fish out of water here. I'm a city planner attorney by background, and I've worked on housing advocacy for the last 15 years. The first half of that time was really trying to make the case to local governments, particularly in the public health domain, that dealing with upstream racial inequities required looking at housing. I think everyone pretty much understands that now. And I really saw the limits of local policy without the financial and market incentives in place. So the last few years, I've been trying to understand more of the investment space and now make the case to people in the financial sector uh, about the need for equitable housing investment. So I feel like your preliminary comments and Nick, your comment about the mortgage sort of primes this perfectly. And I'm going to talk for a little bit because it's sort of complicated. And I just am excited to have this platform to make this case. So I, my sense, the reason I came to working on housing is because it is the predictor, expression, and driver of racial inequity in this country. And I don't think you can grapple with climate change or equity without addressing housing policy and investments. I'm really glad that Brian brought up New Orleans. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, you can go as far back as the Trail of Tears. You can look at Hurricane Katrina, and you can look at the displacement and gentrification that's happening in Miami right now. But in each case, you're seeing financial institutions and governance that are promoting access to private property at the expense of producing precarity for communities of color. And so I think when people think about redlining, they tend to focus on how communities of color and mixed neighborhoods were undervalued by credit ratings. But I think we also have to recognize that redlining was accompanied by a bunch of policies and investments that built wealth through mortgage instruments, through increased access to homeownership that was simultaneously being denied to communities of color, and that over time, the value of those homes, which were bought through these new federally backed mortgages, increased through large-scale investment in suburban infrastructure and roads, while urban communities were subjected to what Ruth Gilmore calls strategic neglect for 50 to 70 years, which further decreased the value of neighborhoods and redline communities. And then more recently, what we are seeing in the housing space, which is where I think this climate finance piece is really important to link, is that housing has become an increasingly important part of our economy. Brian mentioned the $3 to $5 trillion in the mortgage market. As the US and other countries have moved away from providing social housing towards the global financialization of housing, real wages have stagnated, our social security net has atrophied, and so a more and more significant part of our economic growth is fueled by increased home equity. And that home ownership has become a form of asset-based welfare for those who own homes, where private equity is the ATM machine that families use to pay for things that have gotten more expensive, the state provides less access to. And in order for privately owned homes to play that role, there needs to be a continuous rise of real estate prices. So you have a large portion of the United States whose financial well-being depends on housing insecurity for others. And this is a highly racialized manufactured housing scarcity that drives up housing values for some while others have been locked out. So in California, we have a really strong economy. It's one of the strongest in the world and some of the most expensive housing. 63% of whites own their homes and 38% of blacks do in the state. As a result of that and this 70 years of uneven development, we have a huge racial wealth gap. So if you look at LA, the median household wealth for white residents is $335,000, while the median wealth for black residents is $4,000. So I think the connection between mortgages and the types of investments that we have made and the particular precarity that communities are facing around housing and climate change has to be understood as interconnected. And then just to add another layer of complexity to that story, when you have these segregated housing systems in an overvalued housing market, the conditions make low-income renters particularly vulnerable to displacement. And so, if we think about Neil Smith's rent gap theory, which points out how rent gaps drive gentrification, we know that many of the areas that suffered from redlining are most susceptible to gentrification because the land has depreciated, and so it's ripe for value creation. But what Neil Smith didn't perceive in the 1970s was how climate change could accelerate those pressures. And so as climate risks become more visible, you have additional gentrification pressures on undervalued areas that have lower climate risks. So the last thing I'll say on this connection is, I think everyone here is super familiar with some of the, amazing and mixed efforts that have come out of AB 32. Again, where I think housing is the linchpin, we've seen some really encouraging progress around investments in new technologies and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But the state has been much less effective at ensuring production and preservation of affordable housing. So a lot of those gains are being offset by people moving further and further from job centers or out of the state altogether. And because AB 32 doesn't look at per capita greenhouse productions, there are actually incentives for local governments to limit population growth and housing production. So this, in conjunction with our affordability crisis, means that residents of places like Paradise, many of them were pushed out of housing centers into wildfire zones or are being pushed into wildlife urban interfaces, which increases our collective climate vulnerability. So I think we can't really get to grappling with and mitigating the impacts of climate equity, climate vulnerability, unless we're really looking at the impacts for communities that tend to not own homes, have fewer resources, and are already in a pretty precarious situation. It's a long answer.
Yeah, no, that was great. I have a lot of follow-up questions, but you raised a very, you issue spotted something I think which is pretty important, and both for Nick and for Brian. But before I go back to them, one of the things that I think you highlighted in your discussion is, really this role of policy, but also how the public balance sheet is spent. You implied some, in some of your comments that maybe we weren't being as strategically minded about resilience and equity in how we spend our public balance sheet. And then at the end, I think your note that, if we do things like that, that increases our collective vulnerabilities, that's going to come back and cost the public balance sheet anyway, right? So maybe it was a very, very interesting kind of insights. Maybe you could talk a little bit about CDFIs and your thinking about community development institutions and helping, accelerate the resilience of those who are most vulnerable in our and low-income communities.
Yeah, sure. So I think that I worry a lot about the CDFI space, and I also think it's a place of huge opportunity. I think that consolidation and squeeze on community finance a little bit after the Great Recession has created some investment deserts for some of the poorer communities, particularly in California, as CDFIs have moved from being so tied to place. So they're looking, their footprint may be a region, it's broader. And if you're looking at an investment between Stockton and Oakland is going to get more of that investment. So that is a concern about the movement away from place-based lending towards specific lending. But I also think that there's a lot of opportunity in looking at specific lending products. And I think this leaning into this shift in the context of climate change is really important, because there need to be mechanisms for bundling risk so that place-based investments of a lender are not all within the same climate footprint. And I think CDFIs, some of them have done a really great job of developing products for specific types of developments. And I think we need to be thinking about the same framework for climate risk, particularly to your point, and Brian's, like, we don't really know how climate change is going to accelerate and show up. It's a quickly moving target. So we need a lot of experimentation on a variety of mitigation strategies. And so I think thinking about watersheds or wildfire corridors and building products around that provides some really interesting opportunities. But I also think, and CDFIs already do this in general, and this goes to the point Nick made about the cost of doing nothing. I do think that there needs to be a movement for all lenders away from profit maximizing to profitable, because the existential costs of the many projects that are profit maximizing in the short term is way too high for sustainability. And so, you know, investors who are expecting an 8% return, a lot of long-term climate investment deals are just going to fall apart. So I think that's, again, where government has a really important role to play. And, you know, I'm hopeful we're going to have some infrastructure investment money and some new incentives that will, like, you know, push a new analytical capacity for local investors. But I do think those local investors have the best opportunity to understand what the needs are and drive money to the communities that are most vulnerable.
That's great. And I love that idea of moving from profit maximizing to profitable. That's a nice concept or nice framing. Nick, I'm going to turn to you because your bond, the forest bond, has a blend of patient capital within it. Does have a lot of below market or capital that doesn't need to be profit maximized for the outcomes. Maybe if you could say something about, you know, what you think the role of that capital is, and also connect it to kind of the scalability question that you were answering before.
Yeah,
that would be great.
So yeah, that first project was a blend of 2 market rate investors and then 2 foundations that put on their lending hat in the form of program related investments. You know, there's analogs to that at scale as well, and there is quite a bit more replication and scale that the foundations could play with program related investments. But every state also has something called its state clean water revolving fund, which is a fixed income vehicle to protect water quality and water resources. That's usually below market, and that could be blended, whether pari passu, so sort of equal with market rate capital, or having different tranches on who's maybe bearing different risk based on performance and execution. Part of the rationale for a public-private partnership is that so often how the state or federal governments make money available to do these types of restoration projects is on a reimbursable basis. And so, and who receives the award for those reimbursable grants? The communities generally that have higher capacity to put those grant applications together, that have planned projects, shovel ready, one might say. And nevertheless, even when that award is made, if the entity receiving that money isn't well capitalized to pay contractors quickly and scale up, then there's going to be a lack of confidence from the state and federal governments that that grant will actually even be successfully put to work. So there's maybe some policy with respect to advancing what are these reimbursable grants and reimbursable awards. The same time is through a public-private partnership, part of the role of that lender investment capital is assuming a bit of the risk that this can be performed and executed in a way that de-risks the government from providing that capital before it's been validated that the work has been completed. So there's also opportunities for types of capital with donor advised funds. So investors looking for a low, stable return that also is putting that money to work in mission-oriented and climate-resilient ways. This could also be a type of ideal investment. So all sorts of entities. The other investor, one of them is a AAA's arm in California. The notion that, well, maybe an investor also is having some risk reduction if they have insurable assets. They're not a paying beneficiary like we showed in that graphic, but you still could have investors who are part of the system saying, we need resilience broadly. We want to invest in projects that do that. That may actually help not just communities, but their interests as well, long run, especially at scale, by reducing their exposure. So.
And of course, if you integrate or you incorporate risk measures into your financial model, you're kind of you could get a whole bunch of financial benefits there too.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting. So I'm going to ask Brian, you the last question, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. But Brian, you've been hearing from Nick and Sunita about a couple of different ideas. From Nick, kind of some bond, the forced resilience bond example, and from Sunita, the real need to get kind of money locally addressing kind of vulnerable communities. Both of them have had the influence of good, or they identified the influence of good public policy and policy-related drivers to essentially help accelerate some of the things that you're doing. Can you talk a little bit about how policy fixes, incentives, government funding can integrate into solution sets or pipelines that can help you see more of the right things that you and your clients want to invest in?
Yeah, I think it really strikes me, and I've hung out with quite a few CDFIs, and it's a lot like, it's very much herding cats. I apologize if anyone, they all want to do their individual thing. And this is where not unlike we're talking about, these are very big scale problems that we need to solve. And unfortunately, the bulk of the investment community, they're never going to combine, they're never going to take a lower return because it's a good thing to do. So they're going to stick to the, Sunita, if it's 8%, they need 8%. And the other thing, there's a huge move in the investment industry towards ESG. ESG has so much veneer on it, and it solves none of these problems. It's only impacting corporations and how they act. And it's maybe to your point, Nick, around the best ESG companies are the ones that have the biggest policy groups that can, or combined with marketing, that can put it all together. So there's huge opportunities here, huge problems. And I think you need state governments and federal governments to think about how leverage works. And the foundations are kind of showing them, like with guarantees, et cetera. But I think Sunita's example is fantastic in terms of home ownership and the action. So the mortgage market functions correctly right now. Why not get people money that we use on tax credits, LIHTC, at HUD, et cetera, Section 8 housing? It just gets flushed because it doesn't turn into wealth. It's money we're gonna have to pay forever. So why not turn that into a way to get families into homes in the right areas? And then we're setting them free, teaching them how to fish. But I don't know if I answered your question. I'm sorry, I was on it.
Well, no, it's interesting. And I guess one question would be, what's the levers to do that? Is it policy? Is it some certain standards on mortgage underwriting? Is it a risk assessment on resilience and climate vulnerability? Are there things that the ecosystem of financial actors, let's talk about the mortgage and housing kind of sector for a minute. Are there things that each one of those entities can do to kind of effectively have an outcome that's more resilient, more equitable? And there's a lot of people in those chains. There's the homeowners, there's the mortgage underwriters, there's HUD and the Fannie Mae's and Freddie Mac's of the world. Are there things that those entities could be doing to essentially incentivize, signal, and or affect a greater resilience or equitable outcome? And recognizing that there's likely not one silver bullet for all of it. Everybody has a role to play, right? Any thoughts on that, Brian?
It's obviously it's huge.
Yeah.
It's huge. And I think, and maybe the one point is that it's that combo of, the point was made that it's a local problem and it's a national problem. It's a global problem. So how do we, it's difficult to coordinate. And maybe that's the whole problem with climate change and how slow we've been moving.
Yeah.
Is that no one has enough power to change, or do we just have to change the right group of regulations, et cetera?
Right. Yeah. It's quite a conundrum. We're going to open it up for questions, and we have one that I'll start with because I think it's a nice segue here. So is the panel able to talk about non-equity or traditional investing vehicles like debt? Maybe I will start with you, Brian, and then we'll go Brian, Nick, and Sunita.
Specific to liquid tradable debt, is there a more specific question? It's what I do all day long, and so I'm totally prepared to
Yeah.
speak to.
I don't know who asked it. It just showed up.
Me.
ahead,
Hi
Jillian.
there, Brian. I'm Jillian Misrak with Lacey, the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. And we actually are standing up a revolving debt fund for our clean tech startups that we work with here in the LA region, but we're scaling it nationally. And just wanted to see, sort of what you and maybe the other panelists thought about debt as part of this sort of capital stack.
Debt is, and this speaks to the leverage aspect, which is understanding what kind of losses get built into a given project or potential for losses, make that be equity. And if it's low, or if you have a really powerful, imagine in one of Nick's examples where you need 4 million of patient money to create 15 million of debt money that can maybe, and if you put Rockefeller at the bottom or the state of California at the bottom, and then people will flock in for very low returns on debt if you have the right guarantees in place. So I think it's use as much debt as possible.
Yeah, that's our thought, but just wanted to see if there felt like there was some alignment.
Yeah, there's just to add those projects so far, unlike the mortgage backed securities, is that there is no equity being blended with debt for the projects, which from a social justice standpoint with respect to watershed restoration and natural resource protection, all of the gains, if the project outperforms, for example, and we do report on water quality and environmental metrics to the beneficiaries who are making fixed payments, all of the gains are for those public entities and the community, which is pretty nice. So I like the debt structure for natural resource protection. There are, in terms of operating companies too, I should reach out, we should connect after this, because I know there's a debt funding model up in the Pacific Northwest for climate technology development too. And there's even things like revenue share agreements and things if there's sort of different types of structures like nonprofits that are developing technologies too. So
yep, great.
Great, Sunita, anything to add on that? Okay, so another question, and if this is you, please chime in and maybe expand. So another question from the audience: how could ESG investing be made more effective for climate resilient and equitable investments? And maybe take this from the fewest number of most important things, because it could be a lot of different things. And I'll start with you, Sunita.
So, I mean, I think I really agree with Brian's point around the sort of regulatory restrictions. And, when I said the thing about profitable versus profit maximizing, I recognize no one's going to choose that. But I think that we don't have the right incentives. And, when I was thinking about this call today, I was thinking about how a lot of our financial instruments came out of like 18th and 19th century needs to capitalize large resource extraction projects. And we've built complexity on top of it, but the railroad model, the timber model, and the financing that you needed for companies to take the risk are not quite, we're not facing the same types of risks. And we don't necessarily want companies to be taking those types of risks. And so I think, to Brian's point, I think what we have done is we've added on little tweaks here and there to our existing structures, and that might not be the way to go. And so I don't really know what it looks like, but I do think that this is it's true with that. I don't know if folks have been watching the Facebook thing, but like the way that we regulate social media certainly Facebook is not the radio, you know, and we don't really have mechanisms for the 21st century. And I think that is really true in this space. So it's not a specific suggestion, it's just a framework shift.
Yeah. Brian, maybe any thoughts about that? And I mean, maybe just Sunita to kind of pick up on what you just said and the profit maximizing. Brian, do you think that, so your thoughts on ESG investing, but do you also think that there's going to be some internalization of risk on the non-sustainable investments that people seem to still be flocking to at any point in time?
I think ESG is begging for regulation in the US. It's total Wild West. And that would be an easy one to legislate or have the SEC do something about, because financial entities throw the phrase around too loosely without doing a lot underneath in many cases. And in terms of the investment risk awareness, I think that investors are risk aware, but there are enough that are not unlike the reactive herd, in terms of resiliency measure, mitigation measures we're talking about. So investors are going to finance stuff if they get paid what they think is the acceptable return. And right now it's not. And the big reason is really around negative externalities. So there's such a free ride of trillions of dollars. Like the Huntington Beach is a great example where we're the ones that are paying for it, not the investors in whatever pipeline. So and that still exists.
Yeah, absolutely. We could talk for hours about that particular topic for sure. I did want to, Brian Fairhurst, you had a question. Maybe I'll let you chime in.
Sure, thanks, Stacey.
Oh, wait, I'm on double.
Sorry, I need to. Can you hear me okay?
Still a bit.
So I just had a comment on the ESG question. That's an area we focus on at RBC, as well as impact in the equity side. And the challenges with ESG is that many are trying to approach it as a data-driven approach. And ESG right now isn't supported by consistent long-term data. It's a very subjective, nuanced and long-term element. And so if you really want to affect change, you need to change behavior. And divesting from fossil fuels doesn't leave you a seat at the table to change behavior. You lose your advocacy.
Everyone, sorry, Brian, can I interrupt you for a moment? You have an echo, so it's almost impossible to understand you.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what's going on. Let me try this.
Or you could drop it in the chat.
Is there still an echo?
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. I was trying to fix that. So the problem with ESG is everyone's trying to approach it as a data-driven element now. And the data consistency isn't there over time to really allow that to be effectual. The other approach is trying to basically defund extraction. But that doesn't address the largest carbon footprint, which is consumption. So if you want to really make quick changes to ESG, you need to engage and shape behavior and really affect the cost of capital. Defunding extraction doesn't do that. Divesting doesn't do that yet. It doesn't put the hurt in place that we all hope it will. So if you're looking to invest in those lines, you need to find a manager who's highly engaged, retains a seat at the table, and is trying to find actors who want to do a better job, want outside guidance and consulting, and want to do something more than put a pretty CSR report together at the end of the fiscal year. And sorry for the echo.
Great, thanks. I think we might be out of time. Sunita says we have an excess capital problems driving money into housing speculation. Absolutely. We could have a whole other session on just housing investing and climate resilience, but I'll turn it back to Alan. Alan, back over to you to wrap us up.
Sure. Thank you so much. As Stacey said, all of these topics that have been shared, we can totally have more and more sessions around this. And I think these are very important conversation, and we are just hitting the tip of the iceberg. Sorry for the pun, but this is something that reflecting from this conversation is we definitely need to accelerate climate investments. Because we just don't know how fast and quickly climate change is going to affect us. So I think given the time that we have, I just really want to have all of you to continue to engage with us at Philanthropy California as we put on more and more of these programs around impact investing and the intersection of impact investing around climate change and a whole host of other issues that we address. And so I just want to engage with all of you and also want to get your feedback about this program so we can improve future programming. Please take a moment to take a quick poll. I think it's a 3-question poll that will be in the chat box. And just we want to say thank you to all of our moderator and speakers for attending this session and giving us your insights and expertise, and for all the audience for participating. Thank you to Stacy for moderating. Thank you to Nick, Sanetta, Brian, and the other Brian for participating. We wish all of you a very healthy and healthy and restful rest of your week and the weekend. And thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, we will see you at the next call. Take care.